In Rome, deep in the heart of the Vatican, they say there is an amazing object.
It becomes one of the real marvels of the city and one of the chief things that a pilgrim would go and see and venerate.
Not a painting or icon, but a true image of Jesus Christ. It is called the Veil of Veronica.
The Veronica was believed to be a piece of fabric that touched the face of Christ and then bore a miraculous image.
Venerated for over 1,000 years, this was once the most prized relic in Christendom and an object of pilgrimage. But one man has a shocking revelation. He believes the object in the Vatican is a fake. And he knows because he's found the real one. This is the story of Paul Badder's journey of discovery to find what had happened to the true face of God.
Confessing that this face has gone lost, it was a hard thing to do.
If he is right, his discovery could have huge implications for the history of the Church and for the future of Christianity itself.
It was the first time for around 500 years that the Pope saw and venerated the true face of Christ.
The story began at a dinner in Turin when journalist and author Paul Badder met German art historian Professor Heinrich Pfeiffer. Father Pfeiffer told Paul an amazing tale that, if true, could rewrite history, be the most significant discovery in Christianity, and show how what was once one of the most venerated objects in the Vatican could be a fraud.
I raised my glass to him and thought he must have been crazy.
The story revolved around a fabulous relic, the Veil of Veronica, whose origins are immortalized in most churches as the so-called sixth station of the cross. The stations of the cross take us through Christ's last terrible journey to his execution.
Every church has these images that we call the Stations of the Cross, and that allows us to accompany Jesus as he makes his way from his condemnation to death by Pontius Pilate right up to the moment of crucifixion and his burial.
Step by step, the stations tell the tale of the horrific suffering Jesus faced in the lead-up to his death.
He was scourged and crowned with thorns before he carried the cross through the narrow streets of Jerusalem.
Along the way, Jesus is met by friends and supporters who share in his pain and suffering. One of them was said to be a woman known as Veronica.
A pious woman of Jerusalem saw Christ suffering and bleeding and sweating, and she took her sweat cloth, which was a cloth she was wearing around her head, and gave it to him to dry his face from blood and sweat.
The legend has it that when Christ handed the cloth back to her, miraculously, an image of his face had transferred to the material. But it is only a story. Veronica herself is not actually mentioned in the Bible.
The legend of Veronica is moving us because it is a legend of compassion and love and a miracle. And it allows us to have an image of Christ.
Whatever its actual origin, stories of a cloth bearing a miraculous image of Christ, not made by human hands, continued to circulate throughout the early Christian period.
There's a whole interconnected network of legends about a miraculous image of Jesus' face, which seem to come from different sources and have different motivations behind them.
Somehow, this miraculous cloth with its image of Christ made its way to Rome.
The first documented evidence of the Veronica being in Rome is from 705, when Pope John VII built a shrine for the Veronica.
By 1200, the Veronica was on permanent display in St. Peter's Basilica, and thousands of people flocked to see it. This image became hugely important to the world of art. Until then, artists had no idea of what Jesus actually looked like. There are no clues in the Gospels, so they depicted him in an idealistic or general way.
There are images of Jesus in the catacombs and elsewhere from the 2nd and 3rd centuries where Jesus just looks like a normal young Roman man, clean-shaven, a bit plump. You can only identify him by the fact that he's performing a miracle, and he's normally doing it in the way that a Roman god would do. So, for example, he's curing someone by touching them with a stick.
But when the Veronica appeared, all that changed. Now, artists and worshippers could look at an actual image of a real face.
It was very visual, and especially in the Middle Ages, the visual side of the faith was tremendously important. Having this imprint of Christ's face was almost as good as having a photograph.
You had an idea how God, who became man, really looks. God was not an idea, it was a face. God got a face, a human face.
This same face was seen and copied by many of the great artists and appeared in more and more works. It became the model for Jesus. The characteristics are always the same: the parted hair, the thin beard, the nose and mouth.
The Veronica was copied widely, and the simplified image of Christ's face was distributed across the world.
In fact, this image became so popular that a whole guild of specialist artists was created just to meet the demand.
From the middle of the 14th century, you get really clear evidence for people who are reproducing the Veronica and reproducing the holy images of Rome and selling those on as copies, but copies which bear the same spiritual authority and miracle-working power that the original did.
The Veronica proved not only a potent symbol, but also a great source of revenue as an object of pilgrimage.
The Veronica becomes a very important relic in Rome, that there's a chapel dedicated to it in St. Peter's. It soon becomes even the symbol of pilgrimage to Rome. So it becomes one of the real marvels of the city and one of the chief things that a pilgrim would go and see and venerate.
Successive popes used the Veronica to increase their prestige and influence.
Innocent III is particularly interested in promoting the Veronica, in part to promote the city of Rome itself and to encourage the pilgrimage to Rome.
Pope Innocent III granted indulgences for those who prayed before the Veronica, gave it its own feast day, and even promenaded it around the city.
The highlight of the Holy Year was the showing of the Veronica, because this was the encounter with Christ on earth when we were still alive.
Eventually, the Veronica became big business. Numbers visiting Rome became so vast that the decision was made to tear down the old Basilica of St. Peter's and rebuild it.
One of the ways in which popes of the early Renaissance proclaimed their authority and created their legacy was through major building projects. And St. Peter's is a good example of a Renaissance pope crafting his legacy with an oversized building project.
Dominating the center of this magnificent new basilica is the altar, which according to tradition was built above the tomb of St. Peter.
And then around it, they have these 4 pillars where they place the relics which were so popular in the Middle Ages: the head of St. Andrew, the Veil of Veronica, the Holy Lance, and also part of the True Cross. And each of these relics, in a sense, being a cornerstone, a pillar of this new Basilica of St. Peter's, the heart of the church.
In other words, the Veronica had become one of the great pillars of the Catholic Church. But then Rome entered a dark period of disruption and violence, and everything changed. On the 6th of May, 1527, Rome was looted and attacked, ironically, by the troops of the Holy Roman Emperor.
The sack of Rome was a catastrophe for the Roman Church. For 1,000 years, Rome was a safe place, where all the pilgrims and the kings and the emperors who came to Rome left important donations at St. Peter.
In an orgy of violence, 500 men were slain in front of the altar, and many of the relics it had housed disappeared.
According to the contemporary reports, the most important relics were given away in a pub, and drinking soldiers were drying their mouth with the Veil of Veronica.
In time, the dust settled, and the new St. Peter's Basilica was finally completed and consecrated. But by then, something had obviously changed. Although the Vatican still claimed to have the Veronica safe, it was no longer on public display. And on the rare occasions when it was shown, it seemed to look different.
Suddenly, the Veronica was not a clear, shiny image anymore, but a dark cloth with some traces of blood.
It led some to wonder if the original face of God had been lost.
So the big question is, what happened to the original Veronica, the beautiful Veronica, which was painted by the painters in the Middle Ages? It disappeared. And here we have the discovery of Father Pfeiffer.
At the dinner in Turin, Father Pfeiffer outlined his theory to Paul Bader, that the real face of God was no longer in the Vatican. Paul was skeptical. He had been warned of Pfeiffer's fantastical claims before. But Father Pfeiffer went further, claiming he knew where the real Veronica was now. 120 miles away, in a small town called Manapello.
He said, yes, there is something quite unknown on a little remote hilltop in the Abruzzi Mountains. He said, how come the whole world doesn't know of it? He said, yeah, that's a mystery. And, he made it even more mysterious. And so it was just completely unbelievable.
Paul dismissed the whole theory.
I thought it's a fine story, but that was it. I wasn't even curious about it.
But this chance meeting would prove to be a turning point in Paul's life. Some months later, whilst traveling with his daughter down the Adriatic coast, Paul found himself near Manapello. And the church that Father Pfeiffer had claimed was the home to the real Veronica.
Then we got there and I thought it was about lunchtime, so maybe we could have a little lunch up there and have a look at it.
The town of Manapello, nestled within the mountainous region of Abruzzo, is in a remote area, off the beaten track, and largely forgotten by the outside world.
We got off the highway, the restaurant was closed, and I got here to the church.
Walking into the church, Paul saw the image for the first time.
The church had a mass, and after the mass I got up there, and this image was just, he looked at me.
Paul was immediately struck by the eyes, the gaze of Christ on this transparent image.
seeing somebody's face is really seeing the person. You know, looking into somebody's eyes, looking at their expression, we can learn so much about that person. We believe that God became man in Jesus Christ, and to be able to see that face as it existed in his humanity, it would be a wonderful link with the divine nature.
Paul noticed that the material was so fine that in certain light, the image almost vanished, only returning when illuminated by a torch.
It is constantly exposed. And you can walk nearby, you can walk around, you can take pictures from any direction, and you can see how the light from the many windows in the church go through it. You can put your hand behind it, you can see your hand. You can put a newspaper behind it, and you can read the newspapers because it is so thin and so fine. And when you get very close to it, you see that the image itself is translucent. You don't see any color.
Paul could have gazed at the image forever, but was pressed for time.
My daughter, she was very impatient. She said, let's get off, I'm hungry, let's have something to eat. So she dragged me away, but I had to look at it one more time. And then he looked at me as if somebody who would just be awakening.
Deeply affected, but not sure of what he'd just seen, Paul couldn't bring himself to believe it was the real thing. And after leaving, put it to one side. Two years passed, and after working abroad as the Jerusalem correspondent for the German daily newspaper Die Welt, Paul returned to Rome. It was here that the Veronica reappeared in his life once again.
So around the corner, I saw a little poster announcing, not a press conference, a lecture of a certain Pater Pfeiffer. So that's my Pater Pfeiffer. So I have to see him. I have to see him again. I have to see what he is going to tell me about the image.
Father Heinrich Pfeiffer is a German Jesuit scholar specializing in medieval religious art.
Father Pfeiffer is one of the leading art historians of the Christian world, a highly educated man and very important art historian.
During the course of the lecture, Father Pfeiffer reiterated his claim that the Manipello image is the Veil of Veronica. During the talk, Paul was struck by the detail in the magnified close-ups. Seeing them brought a sudden revelation. It was real, and he believed in it.
And I thought, this is it. It must be, everything must be true. But these images, there's no comparison to it. I hadn't seen photos like this before.
He was so fascinating, but it became the mission of his life to spread the message of the human image of God around the world.
Paul was desperate to tell the world about these miraculous images and write a book, but he knew how hard it would be to convince people. It was a formidable challenge. He would need a lot of evidence to win over skeptics. The first question is, how can there even be a face displayed in Manipello if there is already a Veil of Veronica in the Vatican?
Every year on Passion Sunday at 5 p.m., you can see what today is venerated in St. Peter as the Veronica, because the canons of St. Peter's appear on the balcony and bless the faithful with the modern-day Veronica, which is in a huge, heavy silver frame. But you can't see a human face.
Drawing on all his Roman contacts, he tried to secure a meeting with the Vatican authorities. Eventually, in summer of 2004, after much persistence, he was granted an audience with Professor Arnold Nesselrath.
He's the director of the Vatican Museums. He's a very prestigious position. He's a high respected person in the world of art.
Keen to learn the Vatican's angle on the Manipello image, Paul met with Professor Nesselrath. He eagerly showed him pictures of the Manipello face. And questioned the professor about what it could be. But Professor Nesselrath would not be drawn into the debate about the Manipello image.
He had heard something of it, and he had heard something of Pater Pfeiffer. And he was from the big front who had decided about Pater Pfeiffer that he's not to be taken serious.
Professor Nesselrath would neither lend any credence to the Manipello image, nor let Paul see the Vatican's Veronica. When pressed to go and examine the image in Manipello for himself, the professor declined, claiming it was beyond his jurisdiction. The official channels had got him nowhere. He needed a different approach for his investigation. If he can't see the Vatican's image, he needed to find out more about the one in Manipello. When had it arrived, and how had it got there?
The problem with something like the image of Manipello is that there just isn't a paper trail, basically. So we know this object has been here in Manipello for a certain amount of time. We know that it arrived there under certain circumstances, but before that, who knows, basically. There's just no way of telling.
Paul realized that if it is real, then the most likely time for its arrival in Manipello would have been around 1527, during the sack of Rome. And there seemed to be a link. Paul's research showed that Pope Clement took refuge in the Castle Sant'Angelo after the sack of Rome. Something as valuable as the Veronica wouldn't have been left behind. Whilst waiting for the looting to end, Paul thought it possible that the commander of the castle had it spirited away to safety, far from Rome. Intriguingly, the commander had an estate in Manipello, and it all seemed to make sense.
One very realistic perspective is what Bade believes in, that the Castello Sant'Angeli, who had land in Manipello, safeguarded it and brought it there to protect it.
But confusingly, there is another version of events.
In 1506, a stranger appeared in Manipello and gave it to a local. And this local wanted to ask questions, but suddenly the stranger disappeared and he believed he was an angel.
This didn't add up, as 1506 is 21 years before the sack of Rome. Paul then looked at what was happening in Rome during this period and discovered very little was written about the Veronica for 100 years after the sack of Rome, until the consecration of St. Peter's Basilica in 1626. Officially, the Veronica was still there, housed within one of the four famous pillars. But Paul discovered something puzzling. In 1629, Pope Urban VIII stopped the veil being displayed. The lucrative trade in copies was prohibited, and he demanded all existing copies be destroyed on pain of excommunication. It was as if someone was trying to hide something.
It was important to recall all the images of the Veronica which has disappeared, and to wait until it disappears from the memory of pilgrims and Christian faithful.
Paul discovered that the story of an angel bringing the image to Manopello first appeared during the time the images were being destroyed. When the Manopello image was scrutinized, 12 townspeople came up with the story that their face of God was brought to them by an angel long before the sack of Rome. To Paul, now this story made sense. The villagers had used this tale to pretend their image couldn't possibly be of the real Veronica, and by doing so, had protected their image from destruction.
It was to disguise something. And then they invented a story, that an angel has brought it here, what you can do easily in Italy, because Italy is full of saints. Miracles are not strange to Italians.
Only after time had passed did the Vatican start showing the Veronica again. But it seemed different and much darker.
The replacement was not a good or bad copy, but something completely different. You had to destroy the original images and replace them by what you have. Later, the Vatican gave out new prints of the Veronica, which resembled what they have today. But this is a clear indication that the original relic disappeared and was exchanged.
The evidence for this can be found in art. Now, not only did it look completely different, so did the copies made by artists. It all seemed to suggest that the original had been lost. Paul was now certain that the original couldn't be in the Vatican, and that at some point the image was exchanged and a new one put in its place. But to prove that, he needed more evidence. He looked at early descriptions of the veil. In the past, it was recorded as being almost transparent. Even the Protestant reformer Martin Luther said it was like a translucent piece of linen. Unlike the blackened image in the Vatican, the Manopello image fitted that description.
There are many compelling reasons to think that that might be the case. The fact that the veil is transparent, that we can see through it, and we knew that was the case for the medieval Veronica.
Paul's attempts to see the Vatican's Veronica continued to be rebuffed. Thinking laterally, he decided to visit their vast treasury museum. He was looking for any evidence that would tie the Manopello image to Rome before 1527.
In the treasury of St. Peter's, there is a broken frame in which the Veronica was once kept. A frame that you could observe from both sides, just like in Manopello, and roughly the same dimensions.
For Paul, it was another clue. Only a transparent image that could be viewed from both sides would ever be displayed in this way.
To have a frame which is translucent only makes sense if you have a translucent cloth, like the Veil of Manopello. The dimensions fit. And this is why we believe that the original Veronica, which was venerated in this frame, is what we today call the Veil of Manopello.
If the true Veronica was still in the Vatican, why had this frame been smashed and the original cut away?
Taking all the information together which we have, there's no doubt about it. It must have been the sack of Rome.
Paul concluded it was the Manopello image that was torn from this smashed frame. The image even has a glass chip still embedded in it.
The whole story of this frame is giving even more credence to the theory of Professor Pfeiffer and Paul Bade that the true Veronica of the Middle Ages is a Manopello today.
It is a conflict about plausibility. If somebody comes up with a theory which is more plausible, I'm the first one to applaud it, the first one.
For Paul, the evidence linking the Manapello image to the original Veronica was conclusive. He was certain that they are one and the same. This now begged the biggest question of all. Could this really be the face of God? And if so, how had it been created? Paul went back to the original story and looked for clues. The problem is, Saint Veronica doesn't exist in the Bible.
One of the striking features of the Western version of the legend is the character of Veronica herself, a saint kind of created by clerical error, if you like. The name obviously derives from the Latin for the true icon, or Latin and Greek. The true image of Christ becomes the Vera Icone Veronica. You've invented a saint.
In other words, there never was a Veronica. Her name simply referred to the cloth itself.
The legend of Veronica was only one of many attempts to explain what we really have. But the name is revealing what we are talking about. Vera Iconia, the true image, was not the name of a woman, but the name of the image.
The implications of this are enormous. If Veronica did not exist, then the image could not have been created when she had wiped Jesus' face on the way to the crucifixion. So how did it get there? Paul examined the material itself and discovered how extraordinarily fine it was. It didn't look like linen or even silk. But what could it be? Researching on the internet, he came across an ancient fabric called byssus.
There are several types of byssus in antiquity, but the most precious one was created from the silk of a shell of a mussel. It's called Pinna nobilis. It's a very large Mediterranean mussel, 90 centimeters. Large thing.
Divers harvested byssus by hand. It took thousands of threads to make the smallest piece of silk. And as a result, it was extremely valuable. Byssus was so precious, it had long been revered as a religious material. Critically, it was used during the time of Christ.
It was the most precious fabric in the antique times. You find it in the graves of the pharaohs in Egypt. You find it in the cloth of the high priest, the ephod made of byssus. In the curtain of the temple, byssus was mentioned. It's mostly translated in English, for instance, shining linen.
But was the Manapello image made of byssus? Continuing his research, Paul tracked down a woman in Sardinia, the last mussel silk cultivator. He flew her to Manapello to see the image for herself.
We brought her here to the image of the veil. She got on her knees. She said, oh dear, that's byssus. That's mussel silk.
Byssus was far too valuable to have been used as something to mop up sweat. So how might the image have got there? Paul went back to the Bible to look for clues. After Jesus died, he was taken down from the cross and laid in the tomb with the different cloths needed for his burial. a shroud to wrap the body, and a veil to cover his face.
Everybody was expecting to do the final burial on Sunday morning. That's why the women returned to wash and clean and embalm the body. When they came, the body had disappeared. The tomb was empty. He was not there anymore, because he was not dead anymore. He had risen.
In John chapter 20, there's that wonderful description of Peter and John running to the empty tomb. They've just heard from the women that Jesus is no longer in the tomb, and they go and investigate. The Gospels are very clear that when the disciples entered the empty tomb, there were various burial cloths lying around, not just the shroud, but amongst others, the cloth that was around the face of Christ.
Such a funeral veil would have been made of a fine, valuable material like byssus. Could it have been that whilst wrapped around Jesus' head, it had miraculously taken on the image of his face?
The Church clearly believes in the supernatural. It clearly believes in the miraculous. It clearly believes that the divine can work in the world. So it's certainly open to the possibility of images made without human hands. It was the image of a Christ who is alive, rather than the image that we find on the Shroud of Turin, the image of a dead man.
For the early Christians, it must have been a revelation that not only the body of the suffering Christ was imprinted on the burial cloth, but we also have the face of the resurrected Christ on a veil. And of course, both relics were venerated and given from generation to generation.
So could the Manopello image have been made by a miraculous process? Skeptics have often claimed that the Manopello image must just be a painting. But Paul discovered byssus has an unusual quality. You cannot dye or paint on it.
Paul Bade verified it is indeed not ordinary silk, but shell silk which you cannot paint. There are some very small pigments by medieval painters who try to refresh or to intensify colors in some point, or maybe even try to put fur images against it to get the replica blessed by the original. We call it second-class relic or relic by touch. But Paul Bade verified it is not a human being.
For Paul, all the pieces supporting his belief in the truth behind the Manopello image were fitting into place. From the Bible, he believed he had deduced what the cloth itself was used for.
Rather than being the cloth used by that pious woman as Jesus carried the cross, that it was actually one of the burial cloths of our Lord.
From paintings, he saw how the same image had been revered in Rome throughout the Middle Ages.
If you compare the Volto Santo of Manopello with all the paintings we have of the Veronica in Rome, they are identical. They are identical even in details.
And from the broken frame, he could see how it had been saved after the sacking of Rome and sent to Manopello, where it had been quietly forgotten for nearly 500 years.
It's so evident. This is the veil. There's no doubt about it. I mean, you could rip my skin off. I mean, this is it.
For Paul Bade, the story of Manopello's face of God was almost complete, and he could start writing up his theory. After completing his research, he sent all his evidence along with photographs to Pope John Paul II. It had been an incredible journey.
I couldn't believe it. But the whole story, every time and again, I had to pinch myself because it's a miraculous story.
Paul's work found a wide audience. Not only was it seen by Pope John Paul, but also by Cardinal Ratzinger, the leading authority on Catholic doctrine and thought, who complimented Paul on his work. And then, out of the blue on Sunday the 13th of March 2005, Paul Bader was granted an extraordinary opportunity to see the version of the Veronica in the Vatican. Making his way into St. Peter's, he was aware that this could be the final piece of the puzzle.
I don't know how come that I have seen it, that all of a sudden the doors opened, I could enter the column.
Within the Veronica column is a staircase leading to a small chapel housing the actual image itself.
Of course, Paul Bader has seen what they believe to be the Veronica in the Vatican right now and had the opportunity to see this relic from close by.
In the depths of the Veronica column, he finally saw the Veil of Veronica. But it was a dark, unrecognizable image, nothing like the old artist's reproductions, and it was housed in a heavy, ornate picture frame. Clearly, this was a completely different image.
What I saw there, I saw a big silver frame. You see this hoax, that I might call it, or copy. Everything had disappeared.
He was even denied permission to photograph it. The Vatican have taken their own photos, but they are rarely shown.
The reason why they don't publish these pictures is they don't want to disappoint the faithful by revealing that there's no face on the Veronica anymore.
To this day, no pope has openly admitted that the Vatican Veronica ever disappeared, or that the barely visible face shown today is anything other than what had always been on display. But Paul had no doubt about what had really happened.
It was a trick. It was a trick from 500 years ago, from these times of Machiavelli.
Paul is certain that this trick or hoax was deliberately perpetrated to maintain the illusion that the Vatican still had the real one. But if this had happened hundreds of years ago, why not admit it now?
I think there's no question that having the Veronica in your church, if you happen to be the Pope, would be an incredibly useful asset. You know, it's an item of incredible holiness and power. Everyone is awestruck by it. You're going to get a lot of people coming to see it, and it shores up your power, effectively, as leader of the church.
Confessing that this face has gone lost, it was a hard thing to do.
For Rome and her powerful popes, such a monumental loss of face would have been deeply embarrassing.
It's a catastrophe for the Church of Rome. We lost the face of God. Not the faith in God, but the face of God.
Paul thought there may have been another reason why the hoax was perpetrated. The Veronica had earned the church a lot of money.
They did not come to see St. Peter. They did not even come to see the Pope, as they do today. They wanted to see the veil.
Pilgrims had to be shown something, and that's just what happened. What started as a small hoax was simply allowed to continue until it became widely believed.
It's easy to dismiss it as just a cynical cashing-in exercise, and I'm sure it was partly a cynical cashing-in exercise, but it was also a way of making that pilgrimage real. I mean, remember, the whole idea of pilgrimage, at least in theory, is to take part in the physicality of something holy.
But others are more sympathetic about why the Veronica might have been replaced.
First of all, I have to disagree with both Father Pfeiffer and my dear friend Paul Bade in the idea that the canons of St. Peter perpetrated a hoax, a pious forgery, a pious fraud. I do not believe it. I believe they were hysterically searching for something and just took the second best and believed it because they wanted to believe it, that this is the right Veronica.
On April the 2nd, 2005, Pope John Paul II died. He was succeeded by the man who had complimented Paul on his book, Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI.
On the 1st of September 2006, Pope Benedict visited Manopello. Often he visited Italian shrines to venerate the relics or the local traditions. And there's that very evocative image of Pope Benedict just staring at the veil in Manopello. There's a real sense of an encounter, of encountering face to face with Christ. He was clearly very moved.
For Paul, this was the justification for all his hard work.
When he came to Manopello for the first Pope, then he prayed here in silence, he bowed, he bent his knee in front of it, and then for more than 8 minutes he's been in silent prayer in front of it. I mean, it was very, very moving.
It was the first time, for we believe around 500 years, that the Pope saw and venerated the true face of Christ, of the resurrected Christ.
Pope Benedict's visit changed everything.
A week later, on St. Peter's Square, in the next audience, he said, if we want to know who God is, then we only have to look into the face of his Son, and there we see who God is and how God is.
Although not actually authenticating the image, Pope Benedict's personal visit gave credibility to those that believed this was the true face of God.
He brought the image back into the world. That's what he did.
Paul and many of the faithful believe there is no doubting that this image is genuine. But there will always be skeptics. They want proper scientific evidence to show how the image got there and how old it is. The guardians at Manopello aren't against testing, as long as it is non-invasive and so doesn't damage the veil. They hope science will develop in the future, allowing for a more detailed examination which they are sure will vindicate their claims. If this happens, then the Veil of Veronica would become one of the most significant discoveries in Christian history.
Just as the Veronica was a very popular relic in the Middle Ages, we're now entering a new period, a revival of this interest in the Holy Face, searching for the face of God, searching for that personal encounter with him.
St. Paul wrote in his letters, if Christ did not resurrect, our faith is worthless. So the veneration of the Volto Santo is concentrating the attention of Christianity back onto the image of the resurrected Christ. And that's important.